Picture a narrow strip of coastline, clinging to the edge of the Mediterranean, barely big enough to fit a small town. At first glance, it looks like a place history might skip over, a sunlit postcard of yachts, casinos, and glamorous events. But behind the polished surface lies a story that stretches back over 7 centuries, filled with daring escapes, political trickery, and a family that refused to disappear, no matter how many times they were pushed to the edge. This is not just the tale of a royal house. It's the survival manual of one of Europe's most cunning dynasties, the House of Grimaldi. Long before the flashing cameras of the Monaco Grand Prix or the fairy-tale wedding of Prince Rainier and Grace Kelly, the Grimaldis were fighters, outcasts, and opportunists. Born into the brutal factional wars of medieval Genoa, they learned early that power didn't always come from force. It came from knowing when to strike, when to step back, and when to charm your way to safety. Their first great triumph came in 1297, when Francesco Grimaldi, disguised as a humble monk, fooled his enemies into letting him into the fortress of Monaco. By the time they realized the trick, his men had taken control, and a new chapter of Mediterranean history had begun. From that rocky stronghold, the Grimaldis played a long game. They faced pirates, rival states, and the ambitions of great empires like France and Spain. Yet time and again they came out intact. Sometimes they fought, sometimes they negotiated, and sometimes they simply made themselves too valuable to lose. They mastered the art of survival by building alliances, keeping their independence, and turning Monaco into a place that everyone wanted on their side, but no one wanted to attack. By the 19th century, they were thinking far beyond military power. Losing most of their territory to France could have destroyed them, but instead, they turned Monaco into a place of wealth and glamour, creating the world-famous Monte Carlo Casino, and abolishing taxes to attract the rich and powerful. The result? A financial and cultural powerhouse hidden inside a microstate smaller than most cities. In the modern era, the Grimaldis still influence diplomacy, finance, and even environmental policy, proof that their old methods of soft power still work in the 21st century. So when you see Monaco today, it's not just a playground for the rich. It's a monument to centuries of clever leadership, adaptability, and the refusal to be forgotten. The Grimaldi story is one of Europe's greatest underdog victories, a reminder that sometimes the smallest players hold the sharpest cards. And trust me, once you know how they've done it, you'll never look at this tiny state the same way again. Welcome to Words of Time, and in this video, we're diving deep into the secret history of the House of Grimaldi, the Mediterranean masters who proved that size isn't everything when it comes to power. History tends to place its brightest spotlight on emperors, generals, revolutionaries, and the occasional philosopher whose words outlast the empires they inspired. These are the names chiseled into monuments, taught in classrooms, and paraded as the architects of our shared past. Yet for every monarch who rode in gilded carriages and every prime minister who gave stirring speeches, there were figures hidden in plain sight, quietly orchestrating the movements of armies and the signing of treaties, deciding fates with the flick of a pen or the turn of a dinner conversation. These were not merely advisors or courtiers. They were the shadow dynasties, the financiers, the merchant families, the landholding clans whose power was both too delicate and too dangerous to advertise openly. They thrived in the half-light, seldom appearing in portraits but always present in the rooms where decisions were sealed. In the late medieval period, when royal titles were both a blessing and a burden, much of Europe's political machinery was greased by the wealth of merchant princes who technically held no crown yet whose ledgers outweighed armies in influence. One can follow the trails of loans that underwrote wars and bribes that swayed councils, and they lead not to the marble halls of sovereigns, but to counting houses where velvet-robed bankers decided the pace and direction of empires. Entire dynasties built their fortunes in the shadows of thrones, lending to monarchs desperate to outmaneuver rivals. In public, kings appeared as the victors. In truth, their victories were mortgaged. The Medici family of Florence, often remembered as patrons of art and culture, also embodied this fusion of influence and invisibility. By clothing themselves in the soft image of benefactors to painters and architects, they deflected the harsher truth. Their banking empire funded wars and seated popes. They understood that control over debt was more enduring than control over land. Land could be seized, debt bound its holder in silken chains. Even when their political fortunes wavered, Their influence remained intact through networks of obligation, marriage, and strategically placed allies in both religious and civic institutions. They became experts in making themselves indispensable, while appearing ornamental. But Florence was far from the only stage for such quiet dominion. Across the Alps, in the fragmented patchwork of the Holy Roman Empire, small principalities and free cities depended on intricate webs of trade and credit. Merchant guilds, whose names never adorned royal decrees, dictated what goods flowed where, what tariffs would choke rival economies, and which rulers could afford to keep their armies in the field. In certain cases, these guilds could decide whether a ruler survived a rebellion or was abandoned to his enemies. The formal power remained with the sovereign, but the real leverage often lay with men whose only weapons were ledgers, seals, and knowledge of the right handshakes in the right rooms. The maritime powers offered another breed of shadow ruler. In Venice, the famed Doge was a symbolic figure, but the true arbiters of the Republic's destiny were the members of the Great Council, and its even more secretive bodies. Wealthy families, their identities guarded with almost religious intensity, decided not only the fate of the lagoon city, but also the balance of power in the Mediterranean. Their fleets carried not just goods but also intelligence, rumors, and threats, tools as potent as any cannon. To be on their blacklist meant ruin. To be on their payroll meant survival. Similar networks pulsed through the Dutch Republic centuries later, where the House of Orange wore the political crown, but the trading companies and merchant syndicates held the beating economic heart. With their ships spanning the globe, these syndicates could pressure even monarchs into compliance by threatening to divert wealth elsewhere. Sometimes, the shadows were occupied by families who avoided titles altogether, preferring the security of being underestimated. In certain corners of Europe, sprawling landowners cultivated not just crops but loyalty. They could summon more men than a royal decree, and their private militias were often better trained and fed than the official army. By presenting themselves as mere stewards of the countryside, they avoided the suspicion that toppled more ostentatious nobles. Yet when disputes arose, whether over borders, succession, or trade rights, their word carried more weight than parchment edicts. They understood the value of soft power before the term existed, weaving themselves into the everyday lives of their tenants, creating bonds of obligation that no official proclamation could break. The 18th century brought revolutions that promised to sweep away hereditary privilege and place power in the hands of the people. But even amid the rhetoric of liberty, equality, and fraternity, the shadow dynasties adapted. Some reinvented themselves as industrial magnates, controlling the factories, mines, and railways that became the arteries of the New World. Political assemblies could pass laws, but without the consent of these industrialists, those laws were little more than ink on paper. They learned to play the markets as their ancestors had played courts, manipulating commodity prices, controlling supply chains, and funding political movements that served their interests. In times of upheaval, they profited by supplying both sides, hedging bets with the cold precision of seasoned gamblers. The Napoleonic era demonstrated perhaps better than any other how quickly official power could rise and fall, and how persistently shadow power endured. While crowns toppled and borders shifted, banking houses in Frankfurt, Paris, and London made quiet fortunes on loans to warring states. These financiers were cautious not to be seen as too closely aligned with any single regime. Their allegiance was to stability, but only the stability that kept their ledgers balanced and their clients in perpetual dependence. When Napoleon fell, they remained. When the Congress of Vienna redrew Europe, they were already financing the next wave of industrial expansion. The 19th century saw the emergence of press barons, whose newspapers could topple ministries or inflame public sentiment for war. While they operated in plain view, their influence was often underestimated. They cultivated the image of independent journalism while quietly aligning with factions whose policies matched their economic interests. In some cases, their editorial choices were less about ideology and more about safeguarding investments. The ability to mold public opinion was a form of power older than the printing press itself, but in the hands of these magnates, it became a lever capable of moving entire governments. In the countryside, aristocratic estates remained centers of influence even as parliamentary systems spread. Landowners could still control voting districts, not through overt coercion, but through the subtler means of economic dependence. Tenant farmers knew that defiance could mean losing their livelihood. Local courts often favored those with the longest family histories, reinforcing a social order that the capitals liked to pretend had been dismantled. These rural power bases rarely made headlines, but they ensured that change came at a pace dictated by those who had the most to lose from disruption. The turn of the 20th century introduced a new breed of shadow power, the corporate boardroom. While monarchs became ceremonial and parliaments debated policy, multinational corporations began to dictate economic realities that governments had to follow. In Europe, as in much of the world, these corporate empires often traced their origins to older merchant or banking families. The surnames might have faded from public memory, replaced by brand names, but the lineage of influence remained intact. Control of energy resources, transportation networks, and manufacturing hubs meant that even democratic states had to negotiate with unelected executives whose priorities were shaped by profit rather than public service. 2 world wars tested these networks but did not destroy them. In some cases, they emerged stronger. Families and companies that could adapt to supplying war efforts found themselves richer and more entrenched afterward. The post-war reconstruction of Europe, often celebrated as a triumph of unity and cooperation, also provided opportunities for those who could channel resources, contracts, and aid in ways that maintain their influence. The new supranational institutions created to prevent further conflict did not eliminate shadow power. They merely shifted its playing field from national capitals to international conferences and economic summits. The latter half of the 20th century saw the rise of lobbying as an institutionalized form of influence. While the public discourse focused on elected officials, seasoned operators understood that shaping policy required access to the unelected experts, committees, and negotiators who drafted the actual frameworks. In Brussels, Strasbourg, and the capitals of Europe, networks of influence stretched across industries, think tanks, and consultancy firms, many of them staffed by descendants of the very families who had once funded monarchs or controlled trade routes. They had traded velvet robes for tailored suits, castles for boardrooms, but the essence of their power, the ability to act without public scrutiny, remained unchanged. Even in the present day, the legacy of these shadow dynasties persists. Some have mastered the art of philanthropy as camouflage, funding cultural institutions, scientific research, and humanitarian projects that enhance their public image while securing tax advantages and soft influence. Others operate through global investment funds, moving capital across continents in ways that can reshape entire industries or destabilize economies. The public sees markets rising or falling, jobs appearing or disappearing, without always knowing whose decisions set those events in motion. To study Europe's official history without acknowledging these silent forces is to read only the visible text while ignoring the annotations in invisible ink that run alongside it. The treaties, revolutions, and alliances that fill history books are often the surface ripples of deeper currents stirred by those who preferred to remain nameless. These shadow rulers were rarely idealists. Their guiding principle was the preservation and expansion of their influence. Yet their legacies are woven into the fabric of modern Europe, as surely as those of any crowned head. What makes them so elusive is their adaptability. When old systems collapse, they reconfigure their strategies, preserving core advantages while adopting the language and tools of the new order. Feudal lords became industrialists, industrialists became financiers, financiers became global investors. Their influence crosses ideological lines, surviving monarchies, republics, fascist regimes, and socialist experiments alike. This resilience suggests that while political systems may change, the human impulse to centralize power in the hands of a few and to conceal that concentration remains constant. The deeper one looks, the more one sees that the real story of Europe is not just about who wore the crown or commanded the army, but about who held the purse strings, controlled the information, and shaped the options from which official leaders could choose. The names may change, the titles may fade, but the shadows remain, stretching across centuries, quietly determining the course of nations while the world watches the theater in front of the curtain. Get ready to have your understanding of European history fundamentally challenged, because the comfortable narratives most people carry in their minds, the ones of noble kings and fiery revolutions, of visionary leaders and brave reformers are only a fraction of the truth. For every well-known public figure who took the stage, there were many more whose names you will not find in standard textbooks, yet without whom the drama could not have unfolded. These hidden architects of history, the ones who preferred to whisper in antechambers rather than speak from balconies, often wielded influence so complete that they could reorder the priorities of governments, redraw maps, and dictate the terms of peace or war without ever being mentioned in the dispatches. Once you begin to look for them, you start to notice a pattern stretching like a fine golden thread through the centuries. The crowned rulers who smiled for portraits were often at the mercy of the creditors who kept their treasuries from collapsing. Wars were planned not only in royal councils, but also around the polished tables of private dining rooms where industrialists, bankers, and landowners weighed the cost of conflict against the opportunities it might bring. These private gatherings were where the conversations could be frank, where no scribe recorded the words, and where the agreements made might never appear in any archive. This world of quiet dominion is unsettling because it suggests that much of what we think of as decisive leadership may, in fact, have been the art of following someone else's hidden script. The 19th century in Europe is often presented as a period of progress, with liberal constitutions, the spread of voting rights, and the rise of national self-determination. And yet, behind these stirring developments, the same shadow dynasties who had once funded crusades and Renaissance courts were busy transforming their fortunes to suit the industrial age. They owned the coal that fueled the factories, the rail lines that carried the goods, the ships that crossed oceans. They financed the insurance firms that covered those shipments and the banks that extended credit to merchants and governments alike. A nation could declare itself free and democratic, but if its economy relied on these intertwined networks, its leaders still had to answer to powers that were not elected by the people. Many of these families and alliances had learned an important lesson. Open displays of power invite envy and rebellion, but invisible control can be maintained for generations. Thus they were often content to let parliaments and kings handle the theater of governance, while they concentrated on the levers behind the curtain. When votes were to be swayed, they understood the value of funding a newspaper, sponsoring a promising candidate, or quietly ensuring that a rival's debts came due at the most inconvenient time. They did not need to dominate every political question. They only needed to ensure that on the issues vital to their interests, the decision would be made in their favor. The great conflicts of the 20th century showed just how adaptive these hidden forces could be. As war reshaped the continent, they moved their assets with remarkable speed, sheltering wealth in neutral countries, shifting ownership through a labyrinth of shell companies, and using personal relationships in diplomatic circles to influence supply routes and post-war negotiations. When the dust settled, they emerged not just intact but, in many cases, stronger, having acquired distressed industries, land and infrastructure at a fraction of their peacetime value. To the public, these acquisitions appeared to be the workings of an impersonal market. To those in the know, they were the fruits of a long game that relied on foresight, connections, and a willingness to act when others were paralyzed by uncertainty. The post-war period brought new tools for quiet influence. International trade agreements, reconstruction loans, and emerging supranational institutions provided fresh arenas where policy could be shaped by those with the right expertise and access. The language of diplomacy became the perfect shield for economic strategy. By framing decisions as matters of mutual benefit, they could mask the degree to which these arrangements safeguarded their long-term dominance. Politicians might come and go, but the negotiators, consultants, and advisors often drawn from the same elite circles remained in place, ensuring continuity beneath the churn of electoral politics. Cultural influence became another subtle weapon in their arsenal. Patronage of the arts was not merely an act of generosity. It shaped public imagination. A museum exhibit, a film festival, or a literary prize could promote certain interpretations of history, celebrate certain values, and quietly marginalize others. This was not propaganda in the crude sense, but a more refined form of persuasion steering the currents of public sentiment, so that when political decisions were made, they seemed to flow naturally from the shared beliefs of society. By the final decades of the century, corporate globalization provided perhaps the most powerful mask yet for these ancient patterns of control. Under the guise of market efficiency and free trade, Companies with deep European roots extended their reach across continents. While their ownership structures had grown complex, often obscured by layers of holding firms and international regulations, the core decision-makers often came from the same families and networks that had been influential for centuries. The playing field had expanded beyond Europe, but the methods control of resources, strategic investment, influence over policy remained recognizably similar to those employed in the Age of Kings. Today, in an era obsessed with transparency and accountability, the greatest irony is that the most consequential decisions are often made in spaces beyond the reach of public oversight. Informal summits at private estates, off-the-record sessions at international conferences, and invitation-only forums where business leaders, policy experts, and select politicians exchange views without press coverage. These are the modern equivalents of the courtly salons and merchant councils of centuries past. In such settings, alliances are formed, strategies coordinated, and outcomes influenced before the formal decision-making bodies even meet. By the time a policy is presented to the public, the key terms have often already been settled. This is not to say that public leaders are mere puppets. Many possess skill, vision, and genuine commitment to their nations. But their room for maneuver is shaped by an architecture of influence that they did not design and cannot easily dismantle. A minister who pushes too hard against entrenched economic powers risks losing crucial investment, facing orchestrated opposition in the press, or being undermined within their own party. Even the most charismatic leader must weigh which battles can be fought without endangering the foundations that keep the country functioning, and those foundations are often controlled by private interests. The persistence of such hidden influence challenges the comforting belief that history is a straightforward tale of progress driven by the will of the people. It suggests instead that while public opinion and democratic institutions are important, they exist within an ecosystem where unelected, often unseen actors play a decisive role. This does not necessarily mean that these actors are always malevolent. In some cases, their stability and long-term thinking have prevented rash decisions or economic collapse. But their priorities are shaped by the preservation of their own position, and this can conflict with the broader public good. Understanding this reality requires letting go of the idea that political history is the whole story. Economic, cultural, and social power can be just as decisive, and these forms of power often operate in ways that leave few visible traces. A sudden policy shift might be traced not to a public debate, but to a change in investment patterns. An unexpected alliance between states might have its roots in shared corporate interests. A popular movement might gain momentum because key media outlets, funded by aligned interests, chose to give it sympathetic coverage. When you learn to read history through this lens, familiar events take on new meaning. The shadows of power are not evenly distributed. They concentrate in networks that span generations. These networks are reinforced through marriage alliances, shared education in elite institutions, participation in exclusive clubs and societies, and the mutual trust built through repeated cooperation in high-stakes situations. Outsiders can sometimes break in, but only if they prove themselves willing to play by the unspoken rules. Those rules include discretion, loyalty, and a willingness to act in concert even when personal interests might suggest otherwise. This discipline is part of what makes these networks so enduring. The most unsettling lesson is that these dynamics are not relics of a bygone era. They are alive and well, simply adapted to the language and technology of the present. The tools have changed. Emails and encrypted calls have replaced hand-delivered letters, complex derivatives have replaced gold coins, but the underlying logic remains. Those who can command resources, shape narratives, and build enduring alliances will continue to influence the course of history in ways that most people will never see. And until we accept that the story of Europe is as much about these quiet architects as it is about the celebrated figures in the spotlight, our understanding of the past and of the present will remain incomplete. Beyond the Habsburgs, whose vast dominions and intricate web of marriages have long fascinated historians, there exists another dynasty whose influence is more subtle yet equally enduring: the Welfs of Brunswick-Lüneburg. To follow their story is to understand that European history is not merely the chronicle of the most visible empires, but also a tapestry woven by families whose power operated at angles just outside the brightest beams of attention. The Welfs did not command the same breadth of territory as the Habsburgs, nor did they indulge in the same grandiose displays of imperial ambition. Yet their strategies rooted in calculated marriage alliances, deft diplomacy, and selective cultural patronage allowed them to influence both the political and intellectual life of the continent in ways that still echo today. Their beginnings were in the world of medieval lords, where power was measured not only in acres of land or the number of armed retainers, but in the ability to navigate the feudal hierarchy with both loyalty and independence. From early on, the Welfs proved adept at this balancing act, managing to maintain a degree of autonomy even when larger neighbors sought to pull them into orbit. They cultivated marriages that extended their influence into the courts of Bavaria, Saxony, and beyond, threading themselves into the political fabric without overreaching. This steady, almost patient accumulation of alliances created a foundation that would later allow them to pivot into the most unexpected of roles: claimants, and ultimately holders of the British throne. The leap from continental lords to rulers of Britain was not a sudden stroke of fortune, but the culmination of generations of careful positioning. In the often volatile politics of European succession, where a single child's birth or death could upend decades of planning, the Welfs made themselves invaluable by keeping ties to multiple royal houses, ensuring that when opportunity arose, their claim would be seen as legitimate, even preferable, to more contentious options. The Act of Settlement in Britain, designed to secure a Protestant succession, became the decisive opening. Through the person of Electress Sophia of Hanover, herself a Welf by marriage and bloodline, the dynasty was linked directly to the English crown. When the moment came, it was not with armies but with the quiet force of legal legitimacy, and the willingness of the British political elite to accept a monarch who would respect the delicate balance of parliamentary power. Once on the British throne, the Welfs known in Britain as the House of Hanover faced the challenge of ruling a realm where their German roots were both a strength and a liability. In their German lands, they could rely on entrenched noble networks and the inherited rhythms of ducal governance. In Britain, they had to navigate a political landscape dominated by robust parliamentary factions, and a press that thrived on public scrutiny. Yet the transnational nature of their rule allowed them to act as conduits of ideas, people, and resources between Britain and the German states. This was more than mere diplomacy. It was a form of cultural brokerage that helped shape the Enlightenment's intellectual currents. While the Bourbon courts of France are often remembered as the great patrons of the Enlightenment, it would be a mistake to overlook the Welfs' contribution. Their patronage may have been less ostentatious, but it was strategically directed toward thinkers, scientists, and projects that reinforced their image as enlightened rulers while also strengthening their political hand. In Hanover and its associated territories, they supported universities, funded scientific expeditions, and encouraged the development of learned societies. These institutions not only advanced knowledge, but also tied the intellectual elite to the dynasty's fortunes. A philosopher whose work was supported by a Welf court, a scientist whose instruments were funded by ducal grants, these were not mere recipients of charity, but participants in a subtle form of loyalty building that blurred the lines between cultural achievement and political allegiance. The Welfs' approach to patronage differed from that of their more theatrical contemporaries. Where a Bourbon king might stage grand salons and court spectacles to display his connection to the philosophes, the Welfs tended to favor more modest, even private, sponsorship. This allowed them to support controversial thinkers without drawing the full glare of conservative backlash. In some cases, this discretion enabled ideas to circulate more freely than they might have in more heavily scrutinized courts. Their German lands, less entangled in the rigid etiquette of Versailles, could become safe harbors for scholars whose work challenged established norms, whether in theology, natural philosophy, or political theory. The scientific endeavors they supported were equally significant. At a time when European rulers were beginning to see practical value in scientific advancement not just as a matter of prestige, but as a tool for economic and military strength, the Welfs positioned their territories as centers of innovation. They invested in observatories, botanical gardens, and technical schools, fostering an environment where the exchange of knowledge was encouraged across national and disciplinary boundaries. By doing so, they not only elevated their own standing among Europe's ruling houses, but also contributed to the broader Enlightenment project of harnessing reason and empirical observation to improve society. What is particularly striking about the Welf's Enlightenment era role is how it mirrored their broader political strategy. Incremental, deliberate, and always calibrated to preserve flexibility. Just as they had climbed the ranks of European nobility through calculated alliances, they cultivated a network of intellectual allies whose ideas could be deployed as needed, whether to justify reforms, bolster legitimacy, or quietly resist the encroachments of rival powers. In this sense, their patronage was not just an act of cultural generosity, but a continuation of the same pragmatic diplomacy that had brought them to the British throne. Their dual identity as both German and British rulers created opportunities and challenges that shaped their influence. On one hand, it allowed them to serve as intermediaries between two spheres of political thought: the constitutionalism and commercial dynamism of Britain, and the princely traditions and scholarly rigor of the German states. On the other hand, it required them to manage suspicion in both realms: Britons wary of foreign entanglements, Germans cautious of rulers whose attention might be divided. Their skill in balancing these pressures was part of what made their reign enduring, and it also ensured that their cultural and intellectual projects were never purely ornamental, but deeply intertwined with the maintenance of power. Even after the personal union between Britain and Hanover ended in the 19th century, the legacy of the Welf's approach to power and patronage persisted. In Germany, their territories retained a reputation for educational excellence and administrative efficiency, qualities that were in part the result of Enlightenment reforms sponsored under their rule. In Britain, the Hanoverian monarchs left behind a constitutional framework that, while shaped by many forces, was influenced by their willingness to accept limits on royal authority, a willingness perhaps informed by their experience of shared governance in the more fragmented political landscape of the Holy Roman Empire. Looking back, it becomes clear that the Welf story challenges the tendency to view history through the lens of the most dominant empires. They show how a dynasty without the largest army or the grandest empire can nonetheless steer the course of events through patience, adaptability, and a keen understanding of the levers of influence. Their rise from regional lords to holders of one of Europe's most prestigious thrones was not the product of conquest, but of negotiation, alliance, and the careful cultivation of both political and intellectual capital. In the grand theater of European power, the Welfs played their role with a quiet mastery that often escapes casual notice. They understood that the most durable power is that which does not constantly announce itself, and that influence, once woven into the fabric of political and cultural life, can persist long after titles change hands. Their impact on the Enlightenment, though less celebrated than that of the Bourbons, was real and far-reaching, shaping the intellectual climate in ways that outlasted their political dominance. And in this, they stand as a reminder that the true puppeteers of history are often those whose strings are invisible, yet whose touch can be felt in the movement of an entire age. The legacy of the Welfs did not dissolve with the fading of their crowns. It settled instead into the political soil of Germany, where their long experience of ruling smaller, yet strategically vital territories, left a lasting imprint on the shape of governance. Modern German federalism, often praised for balancing regional autonomy with national unity, carries within it faint but discernible echoes of Welf tradition. Long before the formation of the contemporary German state, the Welf lands had operated with a degree of self-governance that required rulers to respect local customs, negotiate with regional estates, and accommodate the distinct identities of the towns and rural communities under their control. This was not mere tolerance but a pragmatic necessity, born of their position in a Europe where overlapping allegiances and shifting alliances made rigid centralization risky. In Hanover, Brunswick, and the other territories associated with the Welfs, the ruler's authority was framed not as an all-consuming command from the top, but as a careful stewardship. Local councils had a voice, sometimes a strong one, in matters of taxation and law. Even when the dynasty pursued larger ambitions, whether in the courts of Britain or in the diplomacy of the German states, it maintained a habit of listening to and bargaining with local interests. These habits did not vanish with the 19th century waves of unification and constitutional reform. Instead, they blended into the developing political culture, shaping expectations about the relationship between the central government and the constituent states. When modern Germany adopted a federal system after the catastrophe of the Second World War, The idea that regions should retain substantial authority was not new. It had precedents in many places, but in Lower Saxony, the successor to much of the old Welf heartland, it was almost instinctive. The Welfs had governed in a way that left space for local autonomy, to coexist with allegiance to a larger whole. This balance, while not perfect in their own time, offered a historical template for the delicate compromises required in the Federal Republic. The persistence of strong regional identities within a unified national framework is thus not only a modern innovation, but also the continuation of a much older political rhythm, one in which the Welfs had long played their part. The Welf imprint also reaches, more subtly, into the present through the enduring connections between Europe's remaining monarchies. The intricate family trees of the continent's royal houses still bear the marks of Welf alliances. Through centuries of marriage, the Welf bloodline has mingled with those of Denmark, the Netherlands, Sweden, and beyond. These connections are not always celebrated, sometimes tucked into the background of more immediate national narratives, yet they represent a living thread of continuity from the medieval courts to the palaces of today. Certain ceremonial exchanges between monarchies, state visits, shared commemorations, participation in royal weddings are still shaped by the kinship ties that descend from the Welf era. These relationships can smooth diplomatic interactions, providing a personal familiarity that is difficult to quantify yet valuable in the understated world of symbolic politics. While modern constitutional monarchs wield little direct political power, their role in embodying national identity and maintaining channels of goodwill should not be underestimated. In some cases, the quiet warmth between royal households has helped sustain bilateral relationships during times of political tension. The Welf connection to Britain, forged so decisively in the early 18th century, still resonates in these circles. Though the personal union with Hanover ended long ago, the shared ancestry remains part of the deep background of British-German royal relations. In less formal moments, this shared lineage can serve as a reminder that even across linguistic and political divides, there exists a web of personal ties built over generations. Such ties do not dictate policy, but they can soften the edges of international interactions, fostering a sense of continuity amid the rapid changes of modern politics. These legacies are not confined to the realms of governance and monarchy. The Welf tradition of cultural patronage, particularly in education and science, has left enduring marks on institutions that still function today. Universities and academies that once thrived under their protection became part of the intellectual infrastructure of modern Germany. Some evolved into major research centers, others retained their regional focus, but in each case, the habit of valuing scholarship and innovation remained. In the present, when these institutions engage in international partnerships or contribute to global research, they are extending a tradition of cosmopolitan curiosity that the Welfs helped to foster. In this sense, the Welf legacy is not merely a matter of historical curiosity. It is embedded in living systems, from the legal frameworks of federalism to the cultural norms of academic life. The fact that these influences often go unremarked is partly a result of how seamlessly they have been absorbed into the everyday fabric of political and cultural life. Federalism in Germany is now taken as a given, its historical roots rarely traced in popular discourse. The ties between European royal houses are seen as charming traditions, not as the durable diplomatic assets they quietly remain. Yet both phenomena carry within them the imprint of centuries of Welf practice and presence. The quiet persistence of this legacy reflects the same quality that allowed the Welfs to endure as a dynasty: adaptability. They were never the most dominant power in Europe, but they understood how to work within the constraints of their position, turning limitations into opportunities. They learned to maintain influence without overreaching, to shape outcomes without needing to control every detail. This same sensibility can be seen in the ways their contributions have endured, subtle, often indirect, yet undeniably part of the larger European story. There is also a deeper philosophical echo in the Welf legacy as it appears in modern federalism. At its best, federalism embodies the idea that unity need not come at the expense of diversity, that multiple identities can coexist within a single political framework. The Welfs, governing a patchwork of lands with distinct traditions, had to practice this balance long before it was given modern theoretical expression. They navigated the tensions between central authority and local rights in ways that, while imperfect, demonstrated the possibility of shared governance without uniformity. This approach remains relevant in a Europe that continues to wrestle with questions of integration and sovereignty. In contemporary Germany, the federal structure allows regions to maintain distinct cultural and political identities while participating in a common national project. This is not always an easy balance. Regional and national interests can clash, and the system requires constant negotiation, but it is one that feels deeply rooted in the political culture of places like Lower Saxony. The wealth heritage in such regions is not simply a historical footnote. It is part of the long, accumulated experience that makes the federal system work in practice as well as in theory. Similarly, the network of European monarchies, though far less politically powerful than in the past, continues to serve as a symbolic reminder of shared heritage. These monarchies exist in a continent where republics are now the norm, yet they maintain relevance through adaptation, much as the Welfs themselves once did. Their continued presence, and the personal relationships among them, contribute to a form of soft diplomacy that operates alongside formal channels. The endurance of these ties is a testament to the subtle, often invisible ways that history shapes the present. Seen in this light, the Welf story is not just a chapter in the history of a single dynasty, but a case study in how influence can persist across centuries, transforming itself to fit new contexts while retaining core elements. Their legacy in modern German federalism, their place in the genealogies of current monarchs, and their contributions to cultural life all reflect the same underlying principle. That lasting impact often comes not from dominating the stage, but from shaping the conditions under which the play unfolds. This perspective invites a broader reconsideration of how we understand historical influence. It is easy to focus on the grand empires and decisive battles, the dramatic speeches and sudden revolutions. But just as important are the quieter forces: the governance habits, the interwoven family ties, the sustained cultural investments that endure beyond the lifespan of any single ruler. The Welfs remind us that such forces can be as influential as any army or treaty, precisely because they operate over the long term and through multiple generations. The modern echoes of the Welf legacy show that history is not simply a series of disconnected events, but an ongoing conversation between past and present. The principles they practiced, the connections they cultivated, and the institutions they nurtured continue to shape the structures and relationships of contemporary Europe. To recognize these connections is to see more clearly how the world we inhabit is built on foundations laid by those who understood that the most enduring power is often the least visible, and that influence, once woven into the fabric of society, can outlast even the most celebrated. The story of the Welf's quiet persistence, adaptability, and an ability to weave influence into the structures of politics and society leads naturally to another dynasty whose name is instantly recognizable, yet whose full scope is far less understood. When people think of the Bonapartes, they think of Napoleon. The general, the emperor, the man who redrew the map of Europe and left his mark on law, warfare, and politics. But the Bonaparte name did not spring fully formed from Napoleon's military genius, nor was the family's influence extinguished when his empire fell. Beneath the familiar tale lies a longer and more intricate history, one that begins in the rugged hills and ports of Corsica, winds through the merchant towns of Italy and the salons of France, and extends beyond the emperor's fall into a network of influence that persisted long after the eagles were lowered. Long before Napoleon became a household name, members of his family were already maneuvering in ways that prepared the ground for his eventual rise. Corsica in the 18th century was a place of competing sovereignties formerly under Genoese control for much of the early modern period, yet constantly shifting between local autonomy movements, outside influence, and the ambitions of France. The Bonaparte family belonged to the Corsican nobility, a class whose titles and privileges were more modest than those of mainland aristocracy, but still meaningful within the island's political structure. This nobility was not a purely ceremonial layer. It involved real obligations and opportunities in local governance, the management of land, and the cultivation of influence with both Corsican leaders and foreign powers. Some of Napoleon's uncles and more distant cousins were involved in trade between Corsica and the Italian mainland, particularly with Tuscany and Liguria. These ventures, while rarely remarked upon in popular histories, gave the family both wealth and valuable connections. Commerce was often a more secure ladder to influence than military service in this period, especially for a family whose resources could not match the grand households of continental Europe. Through trade, they came into contact with merchant families, minor nobles, and political intermediaries who would later form a discreet network available to Napoleon when his fortunes began to rise. These contacts were often cemented through godparent relationships, shared investments, and mutual favors rather than formal treaties, but they carried weight in a world where trust and personal reputation were as important as written contracts. Other Bonaparte relatives found their way into the service of regional rulers in Italy and southern France. A cousin serving in the administration of a Tuscan duchy, or as an officer in the forces of a French provincial governor, might seem a minor figure in the larger sweep of history. Yet such positions offered access to information and influence far beyond their official scope. They could secure posts for friends, expedite permits for trade, or quietly relay news of political shifts. These were the kinds of advantages that could be mobilized quickly when an ambitious family member needed support. Marriages also played a part in strengthening the Bonaparte foothold in the wider European world. While none of these pre-Napoleon unions matched the spectacular dynastic alliances of the great royal houses, they were carefully chosen to link the family to circles of influence. A Bonaparte marriage into a well-connected Corsican clan might bring ties to the island's resistance leaders. Another into a merchant family from Marseilles or Genoa could open commercial routes and urban patronage networks. These alliances were not designed to vault the family into sudden prominence, but to build a web of mutual obligations and shared interests, a web that would prove invaluable when Napoleon began his climb. When Napoleon entered the French military academy system, the support he received from his family's existing connections smoothed his path. It is true that his own talent and determination were decisive, but the early introductions, the small endorsements, and the recommendations that helped him advance were often the work of these lesser-known relatives. In a political culture where patronage still played a decisive role, even in the supposedly meritocratic military, the ability to draw on discreet family advocates was a quiet but potent advantage. As Napoleon's career accelerated during the Revolutionary Wars, these relatives adapted to the new political climate with remarkable skill. Some took positions in the administrative apparatus of the French Republic, others continued their mercantile activities under the changing regimes, and a few entered into advantageous marriages with families aligned to the new order. Here, the Bonaparte aptitude for strategic alliance came fully into play. By aligning themselves with key figures in both Republican and more moderate circles, they ensured that the family as a whole could weather shifts in the political wind without being swept away. Once Napoleon became first consul and later emperor, the family's role expanded dramatically, but the groundwork had already been laid. The most visible appointments, the crowning of siblings and in-laws as kings and queens of newly created or reshaped states, were only the public face of a much deeper network. Beneath these spectacular titles were layers of cousins, uncles, and more distant relations who took up governorships, diplomatic posts, or influential roles in trade and finance. Many of these positions were not glamorous, but they placed the Bonapartes at the junctions where information flowed and decisions were shaped. The strategic marriages that had been a feature of pre-Napoleon life now became instruments of imperial policy. Napoleon's siblings and cousins were paired with members of ruling houses and prominent noble families across Europe, weaving the Bonaparte name into the genealogies of states from the Low Countries to the Italian peninsula. Some of these unions were politically explosive, challenging established hierarchies and provoking resentment among the old aristocracy. Others were more pragmatic, cementing ties with allies or placating potential rivals. In both cases, the marriages extended the family's reach into courts and cabinets far beyond what could have been achieved by military conquest alone. Even when Napoleon's reign collapsed and the Bourbon monarchy was restored in France, the broader Bonaparte family proved unexpectedly resilient. One reason for this was that many of the lesser-known relatives had never been as visible or as directly associated with the imperial regime as Napoleon himself. Their positions in commerce, provincial administration, or foreign courts provided them with cover. They could present themselves as loyal servants of whatever government was in place, while still quietly maintaining the relationships and assets that had been built under Napoleon's protection. In Italy, especially, certain Bonaparte-connected families retained control of estates, trading companies, and urban properties. The fluid political situation in the Italian states during the first half of the 19th century created both risk and opportunity. Those with the means to adapt quickly could shift allegiances and keep their holdings intact. The Bonaparte network's pre-existing roots in these regions gave them an advantage over outsiders. They knew which local officials could be relied upon, how to negotiate with occupying forces, and where to position their investments to survive the frequent changes of regime. In France, the restored monarchy had to tread carefully in dealing with Bonaparte relatives who were popular in their regions or connected to important economic interests. Outright confiscation of their property or exclusion from public life could have provoked unrest or damaged local economies. As a result, some Bonaparte kin were able to continue in civic roles, manage enterprises, or serve discreetly in the diplomatic service. Their influence was no longer imperial in scope, but it was still present in the currents of local and regional politics. What is striking about this post-empire period is the way the Bonapartes shifted their strategies to match the changed circumstances. The age of direct imperial rule was over. The new era called for subtlety. They invested in commercial ventures, cultivated ties with rising political figures in the July monarchy and later in the Second Republic, and maintained contact with exiled supporters scattered across Europe. This adaptability mirrored the qualities that had marked their rise in the pre-Napoleon years. A willingness to work through indirect channels, to build influence incrementally, and to keep multiple options open in case of sudden change. In the middle decades of the 19th century, as nationalist movements began to reshape the political landscape of Europe, some Bonaparte descendants positioned themselves as patrons or sympathizers of these causes, especially in Italy. This was not purely idealism. Supporting the unification of Italy, for example, could enhance their standing in regions where they had property and historic ties. At the same time, they were careful not to place all their resources behind any single movement until its prospects were secure. In this way, they managed to remain relevant without risking everything on causes that might fail. The Bonaparte name continued to carry weight, even in contexts far removed from the battlefield glories of Napoleon's reign. It evoked a certain aura of decisiveness and modernity, qualities that could be politically useful to others. Some politicians and monarchs found it advantageous to associate with Bonaparte relatives, either through marriage, shared ventures, or public appearances. These associations could lend a sense of continuity with the dramatic transformations of the early 19th century, while also signaling a willingness to embrace the forward-looking spirit that Napoleon had come to symbolize. By the time the 20th century dawned, the Bonaparte family was no longer a central force in European politics, but they had not disappeared into obscurity. In France, Italy, and even beyond, members of the extended family occupied roles in diplomacy, business, and cultural life. They maintained the tradition of strategic marriage, occasionally linking themselves to foreign aristocracy or prominent industrialist families. This was no longer about preparing the way for imperial conquest, but about securing a place in the evolving elite of a Europe now dominated by nation-states and industrial economies. In this sense, the Bonaparte trajectory from the pre-Napoleon years to the post-Empire era is a study in the varied forms that influence can take. Military victories and imperial decrees may bring rapid, spectacular changes, but the slower work of building relationships, diversifying economic interests, and embedding oneself in multiple networks often ensures a more enduring legacy. The Bonapartes, like the Welfs before them, understood that power is most sustainable when it is not entirely dependent on a single person or moment in history. Even today, the Bonaparte name retains a certain resonance, not just as a relic of the Napoleonic age, but as a reminder of how families can adapt to shifting political landscapes. In some ways, their story parallels that of other long-lived dynasties. The same emphasis on strategic marriages, the cultivation of allies across different political systems, and the ability to pivot from one form of influence to another as circumstances change. The Corsican crossroads where their story began a meeting point of cultures, economies, and ambitions remains an apt metaphor for the networked, flexible approach that allowed them to shape events from the shadows both before and after Napoleon's reign. The Bonapartes' adaptive resilience after Napoleon's fall, anchored in a web of marriages, commerce, and discreet influence, offers a striking case of how power can be preserved and rechanneled across turbulent decades. Yet their story, while impressive, unfolded largely in the politically volatile Mediterranean and Western European theaters, where dynastic shifts were often swift, open, and dramatic. Further north, in a region whose history is sometimes overlooked in broader European narratives, another dynasty was crafting a very different, yet equally effective, strategy for long-term influence. The House of Oldenburg, beginning with little more than a small county in what is now northern Germany, would go on to weave its presence into the monarchies of Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and even Russia. Their power was not always exercised with the same flamboyant visibility as the Bonapartes or the Bourbons. Instead, the Oldenburgs excelled at the long game, balancing martial strength with a calculated control of trade, particularly over the Baltic, and an extraordinary knack for diplomacy that kept them central to Northern European stability for centuries. In the early Middle Ages, the territory that would become Oldenburg was hardly a major center of European politics. It lay within a patchwork of minor principalities, counties, and bishoprics that dotted the Holy Roman Empire's northwestern reaches. These lands were often overshadowed by the greater powers to the south, Bavaria, Saxony, and later Brandenburg Prussia, and by the commercial might of the Hanseatic League in the north. The family that would become the House of Oldenburg began as counts with modest holdings, ruling over a landscape of coastal marshes, trade villages, and fertile farmland. Their earliest records show them engaged in the same kind of localized feuding, castle building, and small-scale alliances that characterized so many German noble families of the period. Yet from this modest base, the Oldenburgs began to chart a path that relied less on brute force and more on positioning themselves at the crossroads of opportunity. Their first significant leap came through an advantageous marriage in the 15th century that brought them the Danish crown. Count Christian of Oldenburg, who became Christian I of Denmark in 1448, was elected king after the extinction of the main royal line. This was a remarkable elevation for a man whose ancestors had been little more than regional lords. From Denmark, Christian I also secured Norway and Sweden, uniting the three kingdoms under the Kalmar Union, at least nominally, and placing the Oldenburg name at the helm of a Nordic realm that spanned vast stretches of territory and commanded a vital The maritime dimension of their power cannot be overstated. Control over Denmark and Norway meant control over the Øresund, the narrow strait between the Danish island of Zealand and the Swedish province of Scania, which served as the gateway to the Baltic Sea. For centuries, the Danish crown, and thus the Oldenburg dynasty, levied the lucrative sound toll on every ship passing through. This revenue stream became one of the economic foundations of Danish power, and gave the Oldenburgs an enduring lever over the trade that linked the economies of northern and central Europe with those of Russia and beyond. The Baltic Sea was not merely a regional thoroughfare. It was an essential artery for timber, grain, furs, tar, and other strategic commodities. In an age when naval supplies could determine the fate of empires, controlling these routes offered geopolitical leverage far beyond the apparent size of the Oldenburgs' population or army. Oldenburg rulers understood that to keep this advantage, they needed both a capable navy and a stable political position within the often fractious northern kingdoms. The navy served multiple purposes: defending the coasts and straits, projecting force into contested waters, and ensuring that the toll system remained enforceable. At times, the Oldenburg fleet engaged in open conflict, such as during the Northern 7 Years' War against Sweden in the late 16th century, but just as often, it acted as a deterrent, an ever-present reminder that attempts to bypass Danish authority would be met with force. Naval power also allowed the Oldenburgs to protect their merchant convoys, keeping the flow of trade secure even in times of broader European war. This command of the Baltic's lifelines fed directly into the Oldenburgs' diplomatic strategy. By holding an indispensable position in the regional economy, they made themselves valuable not just to their own subjects but to foreign powers. States from England to the Dutch Republic to Russia had a vested interest in keeping relations with Denmark and Norway cordial, lest their ships face difficulties in the Sound. This meant that even in times when Oldenburg rulers were militarily weaker than their rivals, they could still exert pressure or extract concessions through the quiet threat of economic disruption. The dynasty's reach extended beyond Scandinavia itself through a series of carefully arranged marriages, much like the Bonapartes but on a longer, steadier timescale. Marital alliances tied the Oldenburgs into the royal houses of Russia, Britain, and various German states. These unions did not merely serve to exchange courtesies. They embedded the Oldenburg bloodline in multiple thrones, ensuring that the family's fortunes were intertwined with those of other major powers. One of the most significant of these ties was with the Romanovs of Russia, producing, in time, the branch that would become the Russian imperial family from the reign of Peter III onward. Yet, unlike some dynasties that aggressively pursued foreign thrones at the expense of domestic stability, the Oldenburgs balanced their external ambitions with a consistent focus on governing their Scandinavian realms. This required managing the sometimes uneasy union of Denmark and Norway, as well as the recurring conflicts with Sweden, which oscillated between being an uneasy partner in the Kalmar Union and a fierce rival. Even when Sweden broke from the Union, the Oldenburgs maintained a hand in Swedish affairs through diplomatic channels, trade negotiations, and occasional military interventions. Their approach to diplomacy was notably pragmatic. The Oldenburgs were rarely ideologues. They aligned themselves with Protestant or Catholic causes depending on the needs of the moment, and they were adept at switching between alliances when circumstances demanded it. During the 30 Years' War, for example, Denmark under Christian IV initially entered the conflict to support Protestant states, but when military setbacks threatened Danish interests, Oldenburg policy shifted toward preserving the kingdom's territorial integrity and economic lifelines rather than pursuing grand religious or ideological goals. The dynasty's skill in behind-the-scenes negotiation became a defining feature of their rule. Oldenburg monarchs and their envoys were frequent mediators in disputes between other powers, particularly in the 17th and 18th centuries. They brokered trade agreements, arbitrated border disputes, and facilitated peace treaties not always out of pure altruism, but because a stable Northern Europe was in their own best interest. Their ability to act as honest brokers was strengthened by their control over trade routes. As long as the Baltic remained vital to multiple economies, the Oldenburgs could position themselves as indispensable intermediaries. The 18th century brought new challenges and opportunities. The rise of Russia as a major Baltic power under Peter the Great and his successors meant that Denmark-Norway could no longer rely solely on naval strength to dominate the region. Yet here, too, the Oldenburg adaptability was evident. They pursued cordial relations with St. Petersburg, cemented through dynastic marriages and mutual trade interests, even as they kept a wary eye on Russian ambitions. In some cases, Oldenburg diplomacy involved playing Russia and Sweden against each other, ensuring that neither could achieve total dominance of the Baltic. By the 19th century, the political landscape of Europe was shifting rapidly under the impact of the Napoleonic Wars, industrialization, and the rise of nationalism. The Oldenburgs, like the Bonapartes, had to navigate the upheavals of the Napoleonic era, in which Denmark-Norway initially sought neutrality, but was drawn into conflict when Britain preemptively attacked Copenhagen's fleet in 1807 to prevent it from falling into Napoleon's hands. This loss was a severe blow to Oldenburg's naval power, yet the dynasty once again demonstrated resilience. While Norway was eventually ceded to Sweden in the Treaty of Kiel in 1814, Denmark, under the Oldenburgs, retained its core territories and adapted to the new balance of power. Even in reduced circumstances, the Oldenburgs maintained their role as skilled diplomats. Throughout the 19th century, they played a quiet part in stabilizing relations in Northern Europe, particularly as industrial trade made the Baltic more important than ever for coal, iron, and manufactured goods. Their ports became nodes in a rapidly expanding global economy, and the family's involvement in trade policy kept them relevant in European politics despite the decline of their direct military might. The Oldenburg legacy in Scandinavia is one of long-term influence rather than short-lived dominance. They were not conquerors in the style of Napoleon, nor centralizers in the style of the Habsburgs. Instead, they leveraged geography, trade, and marriage to construct a durable position in the north. Even today, the current monarch of Denmark, Margrethe II, is a direct descendant of the Oldenburg line, a testament to the dynasty's endurance. The royal families of Norway, Britain, and several other European states also traced their lineage back to the Oldenburgs, reflecting the same pattern of dispersed yet persistent influence seen in other great houses. Where the Bonapartes thrived on the energy of rapid change and dramatic assertion, the Oldenburgs exemplified the power of patience, pragmatism, and the careful weaving of alliances over centuries. Their control of the Baltic Sea, their mastery of maritime trade routes, and their deft hand in diplomacy allowed them to punch above their weight in European politics, shaping the destinies of nations from a base that began in a modest German county. In their story, we see another example of how influence, once established on firm and adaptable foundations, can survive wars, territorial losses, and shifting political orders to remain a quiet but enduring force in the continental balance. The House of Oldenburg's careful navigation of Northern Europe's political and maritime spheres demonstrates how a dynasty can translate geography, trade, and diplomacy into centuries of sustained influence. Yet the story of European power is not confined to the wide, cold expanse of the Baltic or the dense network of German princely alliances. As the Oldenburgs were quietly ensuring the stability of Northern Europe, far to the south another dynasty was at work in a completely different environment, a Mediterranean world of shifting tides, where city-states jostled for trade dominance, corsair fleets prowled the sea lanes, and larger empires loomed on the horizon. Here, along a narrow strip of rocky coastline that might have seemed insignificant to any cartographer with an eye for continental proportions, the House of Grimaldi was crafting its own formula for survival and influence. Unlike the Oldenburgs' path from modest counts to continental monarchs, the Grimaldis' ascent was a tale woven from exile, opportunism, maritime warfare, and the transformation of a precarious stronghold into one of the most resilient microstates in European history. Their origins were in the intense political rivalries of medieval Genoa. The Genoese Republic of the 12th and 13th centuries was a bustling maritime republic, rivaling Venice in wealth and reach. It was also a city perpetually on the edge of internal combustion, as two major factions, the Guelphs, aligned with the papacy, and the Ghibellines, aligned with the Holy Roman Emperor, fought for dominance. The Grimaldis were staunch Guelphs, and their fortunes waxed and waned with the factions' successes and defeats. When the Ghibellines gained the upper hand, the Grimaldi family was exiled, their properties in Genoa seized, and their future seemingly reduced to little more than mercenary service and the hope of returning to power. It was during these years of displacement that the family turned to the sea not simply as a means of livelihood, but as a theater for asserting their will. Members of the exiled clan became adept in the arts of maritime warfare and privateering. In the 13th century, they began to focus their attention on a small but strategically located fortress at Monaco, which then consisted largely of the rocky headland known as the Rock. The Grimaldis recognized its potential not for its meager agricultural land or modest harbor, but for its position a natural lookout and defensive point along the Ligurian coast, midway between Genoa and the Provençal ports. Their opportunity came in 1297 when Francesco Grimaldi, disguised as a Franciscan monk, entered the fortress under the pretense of seeking shelter and, with a small force, seized control from the Ghibellines. This act, equal parts cunning and audacity, marked the symbolic beginning of Grimaldi's sovereignty over Monaco, although in practice, control would pass back and forth between various powers over the coming decades. The incident also established the family's reputation for blending calculated risk with an almost theatrical flair for political maneuvering. The following centuries saw the Grimaldis fighting, negotiating, and scheming to keep Monaco under their control. They were not above forging temporary alliances with larger powers, France, Aragon, or Savoy when it suited their purposes, nor did they hesitate to switch sides if it meant preserving their autonomy. In a Mediterranean world where the tides of war and commerce could shift in a single season, such flexibility was a survival skill as vital as any fortress wall or warship. By the 16th century, the Grimaldis had secured formal recognition of their sovereignty from France in exchange for a quasi-protectorate arrangement. This was no small concession for a dynasty whose entire territory could be traversed on foot in less than an hour. Yet the deal worked for both sides. France gained a loyal, strategically placed ally who could help keep the Ligurian coast out of Spanish or imperial hands, and the Grimaldis gained the backing of one of Europe's great powers without the risk of full annexation. This French connection did not prevent the Grimaldis from exploring other relationships. Their proximity to the Italian states meant they could maintain cultural and economic ties to Genoa, Florence, and the Papal States. They were also alert to developments in maritime trade, ensuring that Monaco remained a convenient stopover for merchants and travelers. While the city-state could not hope to compete with Venice or Genoa in commercial capacity, it could and did capitalize on its location as a waypoint and safe harbor, gradually building an economy that supplemented its meager territorial resources. The Grimaldi strategy increasingly leaned on neutrality as a political weapon. By the 17th and 18th centuries, they were refining the art of being indispensable to everyone and beholden to no one. Monaco was too small to pose a threat, yet too strategically placed to be ignored. This allowed the princes to maintain a delicate balance, offering hospitality and safe passage to merchants, dignitaries, and even exiled nobility, while avoiding entanglements in conflicts that could bring ruin. Their neutrality was not purely altruistic. It served to make Monaco an attractive partner for trade and finance, drawing in wealth and influence disproportionate to its size. It was in the 19th century, however, that the Grimaldis undertook one of their most transformative moves, positioning Monaco as a financial and cultural hub. Facing the loss of most of their territory to France in 1861, they struck an agreement that exchanged sovereignty over Menton and Roquebrune for financial compensation and guarantees of Monaco's continued independence. This loss of land could have spelled decline, but the Grimaldis pivoted brilliantly. Under Charles III, Monaco reinvented itself as a luxury destination, most famously through the establishment of the Monte Carlo Casino. The casino was not simply a source of revenue. It was a geopolitical instrument. It attracted the European elite, bringing princes, industrialists, artists, and politicians into the orbit of the Grimaldis. The wealth generated allowed the state to abolish direct taxation on residents, turning Monaco into a tax haven long before the term became fashionable. This fiscal policy, coupled with a stable legal framework, drew in wealthy individuals and companies from across Europe, embedding the Grimaldis' influence in the financial systems of multiple nations. By the 20th century, Monaco had fully embraced its role as a nexus of finance, diplomacy, and culture. The Grimaldis cultivated soft power through patronage of the arts, high-profile events such as the Monaco Grand Prix, and strategic marriages that linked them to other European dynasties. The marriage of Prince Rainier III to American actress Grace Kelly in 1956 was a masterstroke of publicity, blending Hollywood glamour with old-world monarchy in a way that captivated global attention. This union did more than improve Monaco's profile. It positioned the principality as a bridge between European aristocracy and the burgeoning cultural power of the United States. The Grimaldis' diplomatic reach in the modern era often operates beneath the surface, much as it did in the days of Francesco's monk disguise. Monaco's status as a neutral, independent state enables it to serve as a discreet meeting place for international discussions, both formal and informal. Its financial sector, while small in absolute terms, is tightly integrated into European and global markets, giving the principality a voice in economic matters far beyond its size. Moreover, the Grimaldis have leveraged Monaco's environmental and humanitarian initiatives to build relationships with states and organizations worldwide, further enhancing their soft power. The continuity of the Grimaldi dynasty, ruling Monaco for over 7 centuries with only brief interruptions, is itself a testament to their adaptability. They have survived the rise and fall of maritime republics, the expansion and contraction of empires, the upheavals of the Napoleonic Wars, and the challenges of 2 world wars. Each era has demanded a recalibration of strategy, sometimes leaning on military defense, at other times on diplomatic finesse, and more recently on economic and cultural influence. What makes the Grimaldi story particularly compelling in the broader tapestry of European dynasties is how they have managed to achieve and sustain influence without the vast territorial or military resources of houses like the Oldenburgs or Habsburgs. Their mastery lies in recognizing the value of what they do have: location, sovereignty, and the ability to project an image, and in turning those assets into levers of power. Just as the Oldenburgs controlled access to the Baltic through the Øresund, the Grimaldis control a symbolic and practical gateway to the Mediterranean's high society, finance, and diplomacy. Even today, the Grimaldis exert a cultural influence that extends well beyond Monaco's borders. The principality's reputation as a glamorous, secure, and stable enclave draws not only the wealthy, but also individuals and organizations seeking a discreet yet prestigious base of operations. Monaco's involvement in international environmental policy, spearheaded by Prince Albert II, further underscores the dynasty's ability to adapt to contemporary issues while maintaining its historical patterns of strategic neutrality and global engagement. In the grand narrative of Europe's ruling houses, the Grimaldis remind us that power is not solely a function of armies, landmass, or population. It can also derive from the control of narratives, the cultivation of prestige, and the leveraging of economic niches. Their journey from exiled Genoese partisans to sovereign princes of a global financial and cultural hub is a case study in how to convert vulnerability into strength and proximity into influence. While they will never command the territorial expanse of an Oldenburg empire, their endurance and relevance prove that in the political and economic ecosystems of Europe, size is only one measure of significance.
The story of the Grimaldi family shows that power is not only about having the biggest army or the most land. When Francesco Grimaldi took Monaco in 1297 through a clever trick, he began a tradition that proved strategy, patience, and smart partnership can last longer than the strength of much bigger empires. By staying adaptable, sometimes siding with France, sometimes with Italy, and sometimes with no one, they turned their small rocky land into a place that kings, traders, and even movie stars wanted to visit or be part of. They used their small size as an advantage, building a long standing reputation for stability, safety, and charm that has lasted for more than 700 years. Monaco is still tiny today, but it has influence in finance, culture, and diplomacy. The Grimaldis learned how to be important without being a threat, relying on soft influence instead of force. Their history shows that even in a world led by giants, the smartest player can survive and succeed by knowing its strengths and using them well. It is a lesson in resilience and wise leadership and proof that quiet voices can still shape the future if they speak in the right way.